Hi, I'm Hull History Nerd. Today we're going to be looking at Hull's very first railway line, the Hull and Selby. So regular and perceptive viewers may have noticed that I'm not starting this episode in Paragon Station, which might seem like an odd choice because of all the railway lines we've actually covered so far in the series, the Hull to Selby is the only one that still exists. Trains still run along it on a regular basis today. But the history of the line is a long and complicated one, and it actually has a lot to do with Selby. Let me set the scene for you a little bit. In the 1820s, there was this thing going on in Britain called railway mania. You see, in the north, coal miners had built railways to get coal from the mine to somewhere where it could be delivered. And it turned out that if you took the coal wagons and turned them into very primitive coaches, people would actually pay to ride on the coaches while they were being pulled by a steam engine. And people didn't quite know what to make of this. Some businessmen saw an opportunity for passenger trains, some saw an opportunity for shifting mass amounts of coal, some saw a wider range of applications and linking up docks, for instance, to offload freight and cargo onto trains to quickly move them around the country. So it seemed like everybody and their dog wanted a piece of the railway cake, and railways were being built at an explosive rate across the entire United Kingdom. In the 1820s, a consortium of business people from Leeds, Selby and Hull got together and formed the Leeds and Hull Railroad Company. Railroad. Glad we didn't go down that route. Their initial aim was to rope in George Stephenson and plan a line that would go from Leeds to Hull. And Leeds needed it perhaps more than Hull did, because Hull had its docks. And Leeds kind of wanted access to the stuff that was coming in and going out of the docks. And sure enough, when this idea was put to the investors in Hull, they just kind of shrugged and went, we've already got docks, we don't need a railway. And so the line never reached Hull. The Leeds and Selby Railway Company was formed instead, and this is where it terminated, the original 1834 Selby station. It's now in use as an industrial yard, but it used to be the first passenger station in Selby. In fact, it may even have been the first passenger station in Yorkshire. Not entirely sure about the veracity of that claim, but it's actually on a little plaque outside the building. And this was constructed in 1834, but only a few years later, when the Hull and Selby line finally did link up with it, it was closed down as a passenger station and turned into a goods station, and the passenger station was actually rebuilt slightly to the north, which is the site of the modern Selby station. But Hull was not to have its dock trade all to itself for long, because of this. Goole. The interesting thing about the town of Goole is that in 1820, it didn't exist. It was just a village with a small wooden bridge across the River Ouse. In the 1820s, the Air and Calder Navigation Company, a canal firm, wanted to expand their canal network from the coalfields of South Yorkshire up to the River Ouse, where they planned to build a dock, so that they didn't have to send their trade to somebody else's dock, where they could claim all of the customs and excise money. Goole was constructed between 1824 and 1826, wholesale, and arrived on the scene as an entirely new town, complete with an operating and functional dock. Needless to say,
the dock and ship owners of Hull were not amused. They tried various very aggressive campaigns to try and institute laws such as taxing ships that went past Hull on the Humber towards Goole, but none of those ever took off. Needless to say, in the 1830s, when they were asked again whether or not they wanted to have a railway to the city, the answer was an affirmative, yes please.
And in 1840, on July the 1st, the Hull and Selby Railway opened to the public. And despite the heavy rain, 5 trains full of passengers departed from Hull to Selby and back. Now, bearing in mind this was 1840 and these were still very, very early days for the railway, they were still trying a lot of things out. For instance, one of the early rules was that steam locos weren't allowed in the station buildings because they thought it would frighten the passengers. So what they would do eventually was to decouple the train before it got into the station. The loco would run round the back and then push the train into the station. But in Hull they tried a more innovative idea. Instead of the loco, they thought they'd attach a rope to the carriages and hoist them into the station, to the platforms. Now, bear in mind that the carriages had no brakes and they had no way of knowing how fast they were going, and there was only the buffers to stop them. You can see that that may have been a recipe for disaster. And, indeed, on the first attempt, the carriages mounted the platform and went through the station wall. You can imagine that that wasn't tried again. The whole system was scrapped and locomotives went back to just pushing the carriages into the station. It was safer all round that way.
Meanwhile, in Selby, a new through station was built, right next door to the old station, which was turned into a goods depot. The newer station was renovated again in the 1870s when direct lines to Doncaster and York were set to run through the station. The bridge that carries the line across the Ouse isn't the original bridge. Like with the Wilmington Bridge that we saw in the Victoria Dock branch line episode, this bridge was built for relatively lightweight traffic, and it was proving to be quite inadequate for the heavier trains of the later 19th century. By 1891, it had been replaced by the swing bridge that still carries the railway across today. And, as you may notice, bears a family resemblance to the later swing bridge at Wilmington. In between Hull and Selby were a number of small villages that gained stations. Hessel at the outer edges of Hull, Ferriby and Brough, who were beginning to see an influx of Hull's wealthier individuals as they sought to find a place in the country to live away from the smog of the industrial city. Staddlethorpe, later renamed Gilberdyke, which stood on the branch line that travelled to Goole and Doncaster, built by the later North Eastern Railway to improve travel times between Hull and London. Eastrington, Howden, Wrestle and Cliff all had stations, and as we've seen in previous videos, stations like these were essential in connecting the miles of farmland around here to the rest of the country and feeding the vast and expanding cities of industrial Britain.
So we're going to be doing something a little different in this episode. Instead of going from point A to point B and visiting all the little points in the middle, we're actually going to be taking more of a journey through time for the Hull and Selby Railway. And the reason for that is that most of the Hull and Selby line is still in existence now as a working railway line. If you want to see the stations in between, just get on a train from Hull to Selby. They're there, they're still working. What we're more interested in this series is about the things that we've lost to history, the things that have disappeared, like the Manor House Street station, Hull's very first railway station, which would have been right behind me, here, on the marina, or Humber Dock as it would have been back then. The station had a pitifully short working life. 1840 it opened, and in 1848 it closed. And part of the reason for that was these were early days for the railways and no one really quite knew how big they were going to get. As it turned out, the demand for the docks for freight capacity far outstripped the need to ship passengers from here. So a separate passenger terminus was constructed just to the north at Paragon Station. And here, this was turned into a goods station. And a third goods station was built alongside it, to the south. And finally, in the 1860s, it was demolished entirely and rebuilt into one massive railway goods station, the Railway Street Goods Station. And you can still see the walls of Railway Street Goods Station behind me, because they've actually used part of the walls to surround the Marina Boatyard. Now, in the 1840s, the Hull and Selby Railway was made an offer it couldn't refuse by a man who was an absolute giant in the railway industry, George Hudson, the man who was chairman of the York and North Midland Railway, chairman of the Newcastle and Darlington Junction Railway, and chairman of the East Counties Railway. The man controlled almost a third of Britain's railway networks at this point, and he made an offer. He offered to lease the line indefinitely, which would reduce the Hull and Selby Railway Company to little more than landlords. The York and North Midland Railway would provide all of the actual locomotives, the carriages, build new lines and buildings and stations, and all the Hull and Selby had to do was to sit back and collect the money every month. They agreed. Running a railway in the 1840s was a big business because they were building an infrastructure. Steam engines didn't come cheap and they kept needing more of them. And as the docks were growing and Hull's trade was exploding thanks to the railway, increasing amounts of engines needed to be built, as did wagons, coaches, new railways, new platforms. It wasn't cheap, even when you were making money hand over fist. And the one thing the York and North Midland Railway had in spades was money. The last act of the Hull and Selby Railway was to be building the Bridlington branch. But even in that one, George Hudson was manipulating things for his own end to meet up with his own railway branch that went up to Scarborough. But we'll cover that more in the next episode. By the mid-1840s, Hudson had commissioned the great railway architect George Townsend Andrews to design a spectacular new terminus for his railway. No longer satisfied with Manor Street Station and its pokey location next to the docks and the burgeoning need for extra freight down there, he wanted something more central, something that sat at what was then the western edge of the city of Hull. A vast building was planned, linked to a huge, grand, opulent hotel. Wrought iron ceilings, grand yellow brickwork. The whole thing was designed to make a statement, and that statement was, the railways are here, and they are big. But sadly, this was to be George Hudson's last real contribution to railways in Britain. In fact, the station became known as Hudson's Folly, and the reason for that is that George Hudson had been using all three of the big railway companies that he was the chairperson of, and he had been using them to commit epic fraud, genuinely biblical in scale. The guy was buying smaller railway companies and selling shares in them at vastly hyperinflated prices to fund his railway building. And when this became clear and the press started to find out about it and the rumours began to circulate, he was a broken man. He was forced to resign from all three of the companies that he was actually chairman of, and those companies themselves had to bear the brunt of the enormous financial problems that he had foisted upon them by using them the way that he had. By the 1850s, those companies were rolled into one huge conglomerate, the North Eastern Railway. And that's a story we're going to have to wait for until the next episode.
Passing west, the line from Manor House Street Station was originally right on the banks of the Humber, but as land was reclaimed during the building of Albert and William Wright docks, and later St Andrew's Dock, the line became increasingly far away from the Humber, and more heavily involved with those new docks. A new goods station was constructed next to Albert Dock where, today, an ice arena and cinema stand. And a dense network of tracks flowed westward towards the Hesle East Junction, where the line to Bridlington branched off, and where the connecting cord of line from Paragon Station joined with the old route to Selby. These lines all joined here in an area of fields just outside of Hull called Dairycoats. Dairycoats is a name many railway enthusiasts will know well because it became one of the biggest locomotive depots in Britain and certainly the biggest in the North Eastern Railway's portfolio. Steam locomotives used to be stored in buildings known as roundhouses. Somewhat confusingly, these buildings were square, but inside, a railway track would lead to a turntable, and from this turntable fanned out a large number of tracks upon which could each be stored multiple locomotives. In the corners of the roundhouse could be found offices and storerooms. At its height, Dairycoats had 6 roundhouses as well as 2 straight sheds. It had the NER's only mechanised coaling plant by 1915, and it had 2 pneumatic wheel drops, which were incredibly useful devices that allowed engineers to remove a locomotive's wheels or bogies without needing a crane or props to lift up or support the huge weight. By the time of the birth of the London and North Eastern Railway in 1923's Grouping Act, Dairycoats was home to around 140 locomotives, and it was reckoned to be, in terms of physical size at least, one of the largest engine depots in Britain.
And this single track line behind me is all that's left of the once mighty Dairycoats depot. This huge complex that was full of roundhouses and engineering plants. The whole place is just gone. It's just a single track line that services a tarmac company, and every so often you still see a freight train come past here, but very rarely. And if you head the line up that way towards the east, it ends at Brighton Street, just where Brighton Street meets the A63. And that is the last, most eastward stretch that's still left of the original Hull and Selby Railway that ended at Manor Street Station. And if you go that way, it links up with the modern Hull and Selby line. Just across there on that bridge, that is the newer track that was built to connect Paragon Station to the rest of the Selby line.
The goods yard that surrounded and stretched out westward from Dairycoats, Priory Yard, was enormous, even by the standards of the time. It served as Hull's outgoing goods yard, where goods from all of the docks would be formed into trains to be taken out of Hull by locomotives. And parts of it directly serviced St Andrew's Dock. In its later years, the fishing industry that grew around the dock. Even though most of Priory Yard has now gone, the area it occupied was so huge that no fewer than 6 industrial estates and retail parks and 2 housing developments had been built on the land, and there are still swathes of it left undeveloped. But why did Dairycoats die? One reason could be Hull's fading as a port. We used to need dozens of shunters and mixed traffic locos stabled here to deal with the huge amount of freight brought in through the port. That started falling off with the inevitable rise of the lorry and road-based haulage. By the 1960s, Dairycoats was a shadow of its former self. Most of the locos stabled here were having to travel to other locations to do their work because there was no work in Hull. The huge goods sidings stood almost empty and idle, save for a few rusting wagons and old coaching stock. As St Andrew's Dock's fishing industry itself faded as a result of the Icelandic cod wars, so too did the last reason for Dairycoats to exist. Most of the few remaining goods trains were now permanently fixed in rakes of trucks that worked specific jobs and didn't need shunting, and the development of faster diesel multiple unit trains like the Intercity 125 in the 70s, cut down hugely on the need for standalone diesel engines.
But in the 1870s, Paragon Station was about to get a lot busier. A lot busier because Hull was becoming the focal point of a wave of emigrants from Northern Europe who were fleeing wars and economic problems and hunger to move to the United States of America. But to get there, they had to get to Liverpool and the ships that would take them to New York. And their first port of call in the United Kingdom for many of these people was Hull. Now, the people of Hull and the corporation were less than enthusiastic about waves of tens of thousands of emigrants coming through the city, not particularly for any xenophobic reasons, but because Hull, as a port, had already had more than its fair share of epidemics, many of which were exacerbated or even caused by the terrible sanitation of Victorian cities, but some of which were certainly caused by sailors bringing diseases that the locals had no immunity to. And so a plan was devised to keep them segregated from the moment they touched down to the moment they left the country. And part of the way they did that was they all landed the emigrants at a certain dock, a specific dock that was just for them, a jetty, where their ships would unload them, and they would go straight to a special platform at Railway Street Goods Station, which was set aside for emigrants. That train would then bring them here, and in Paragon Station they even built an entire set of platforms and a separate waiting room just for the emigrants. The emigration platform and the emigration station are now listed monuments because of their history, but these days they tend just to be used by Network Rail to store locomotives and rakes of carriages. And the old emigration station is now a social club.
In 1881, Paragon Station was doubled in size, adding platforms and tracks, and in 1902, another renowned railway architect, William Bell, gave the station a much-needed makeover, replacing the wrought iron roof with the magnificent arches that it bears today, and creating the frontage that we now know today as Paragon Station, reducing the old station building itself to little more than offices. The Hull and Selby Railway was truly Hull's first intercity railway line, connecting Hull with the city of Leeds. There had been horse-drawn rails around the docks for years earlier, some of which can still be seen around the marina, but this railway was the first time Hull's docks had direct, fast access to massive inland markets like Leeds. It gave the competitive edge that the early investors were looking for in their constant fight against Goole, propelling Hull into a railway and dock building mania that would see a further 7 docks and another 4 railway lines built around the city. It lifted the city up as an early adopter of railways, giving it the leg up that it needed to become one of Britain's biggest ports, the 3rd largest at one point. This increasingly vast and dense web of railway was also a huge employer in the city. Drivers, firemen, signal box operators, crossing operators, guards, track layers, repairmen, and the vast numbers of engineers and mechanics and cleaners at dairy coats all contributed enormously. Many people can recall some family member or friend who was a railway worker, and some families were all railway families, where it became standard for siblings to work together on the railway and for their children to follow them when they were old enough. Hull was already growing thanks to its docks, but the coming of this particular railway caused that growth to skyrocket. But the future wasn't all rosy, as the North Eastern Railway caused a few problems itself. But that story, and the story of the Bridlington branch, we will cover in part 2 of the Hull and Selby Railway. Remember, if you've enjoyed this video, click like and subscribe. If you subscribe, you'll be notified of the next episode when it comes out, and it helps me to grow the channel with YouTube, reaching other viewers.